I'm George LeMieux, and I have the privilege of working here at Palm Beach Atlantic with the LeMieux Center for Public Policy. We bring in great speakers from time to time to speak to the students and the community, and we have another great speaker for you here today, and that is presidential historian, Pulitzer Prize winner, and New York Times bestseller, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Me too. I'm very glad to be here.
Very excited. So, one of the questions that I get asked all the time by people, and I know you get asked too, is what's happening in this country? We're so divided. Are these the worst of times? How do we put this time period in reference to other time periods in American history? And as someone who has studied us from the beginning to the end, what's your answer to that?
I get asked the same question, sometimes on airports, sometimes on the street. And this is where history really can help. There's not even a question that these are not the worst of times. I mean, just imagine what it was like for Abraham Lincoln. He comes into office, 7 states have already seceded from the Union. The democracy seems like it's failed because the southern states not accepting the results of the election, they decide to leave the Union. 700,000 people are about to be killed. He later said that if he had known what he was going to face in those first 3 months in office, he would not have thought he could have lived through it. So just imagine that. And then imagine really the turn of the 20th century when the Industrial Revolution had shaken up the economy, much like tech revolution and globalization have done today. People in the country felt suspicious of people in the city. There were anarchist bombings in the street, nationwide strikes. And Teddy Roosevelt feared that if people in different regions and sections and parties started to regard each other as the other rather than as common American citizens, that democracy would be in peril. And so that was that period of time. And then imagine when FDR came in 1933, 1 out of 4 people out of work, the Depression at its lowest ebb. The banks didn't have enough money to get people their deposits back. And there was starving people in the street because there were no safety nets at that time. Somebody said to FDR, if the program you've established in New York, the New Deal, works for the government as a whole, you'll be one of the great presidents. But if it fails, you'll be one of the worst. He said, no, if it doesn't work, I'll be the last. He was afraid this was a real fragile time for democracy. And then think of the 1960s. You had 3 assassinations from John Kennedy to Robert Kennedy to Martin Luther King. At the end of the decade, you had riots in the streets, anti-war violence, a very unpopular war. And there was really a feeling that things were coming apart at the seams. And the real reason why we can take hope is that the people then, they didn't know how it was going to end. We're anxious now because we don't know how it's going to end. We know now, and that's the problem with history sometimes. We know that the Union was secured and emancipation was secured. We know that the Depression came to an end with the mobilization for the war. We know the Allies won World War II. I mean, think of those early days of World War II when it looked like Hitler was going through Europe and we were 18th in military power only. We know those things, but now we still have this chapter to write. And that's why I think history can give us solace, and it gives us lessons and perspective. So I can say, honestly, this is a very hard time, but America's come through it before, and I really believe we'll come through this one as well.
So in all of those times, Civil War, World War II, we certainly had the right leader at the right time, right? I mean, where would we be without Lincoln? I know you write in your recent book about leadership, does the times make the man? Does the man make the times? Where would we be without Abraham Lincoln? Wasn't he indispensable?
Without a question. I mean, that's the real question. An opportunity is provided by a crisis for a leader to become an historic leader, but he could also become an historic failure when there's a crisis. Buchanan, who was in the 1850s before Abraham Lincoln, is now considered one of the worst presidents because he was unable to see that the country was already splitting apart between the North and the South, and he exacerbated that split. And then Abraham Lincoln came, and just having that temperament that he had, a man who somehow was able to acknowledge errors, learn from his mistakes, knew the night he was elected that he didn't know enough to be president, so he wanted to put all of his chief rivals into his cabinet. Never done before like that. And it took enormous confidence and humility to do that. But nonetheless, he had empathy, he had resilience, he had an ambition that was for something larger than himself. He had accessibility, all the qualities that you want in a leader, luckily came to fore. And I'm not sure people would have known that about Lincoln. Everybody who knew him knew that, but he was hardly known on the national scene, and he grew in office, partly because of those emotional qualities. So we were very lucky to have him at that time. And I would say the same thing about FDR. I mean, here's a president who had polio, and as a result of the polio, he had to learn patience. He had to learn humility. He was kind of an arrogant guy before that. He somehow was able to connect to people for whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand. He comes into office at a time when America is paralyzed, and he's got that confidence and that optimism. That very first inaugural alone was able to make people feel, we're okay, we've got a government, we've got a leader that we can trust. Hundreds of thousands of letters came into the White House that night saying, you're there, now everything's all right. It's the mystery of leadership. So America's been lucky to have it at the moments that they needed it, the right leader there. And maybe the crisis helps bring that about, but it could be the other way around.
And the communication skills so important, right? FDR with the fireside chats, using a new technology really of the radio to, which was in everybody's home, to communicate to them. Leaders need to be able to communicate with the people that they represent. How important was that?
Oh, so true. I mean, the leader has to understand the technology of the time. Lincoln was lucky to be there at the time when the written speech was like a treasure. People would read the entire speeches, and then they'd be published in full and read in country homes and city homes. And then Teddy Roosevelt came along at the time of the national newspapers, and he had these great pithy statements, the square deal, don't hit until you have to and then hit hard. And he also was a character that was able to project his personality into these new newspapers. And then, as you're right, FDR had the perfect voice for radio, that conversational, intimate voice. It was said that people really thought he was in their living room. There's a story of a construction worker hurrying home that night, and his partner said, where are you going? He said, well, my president's coming to speak to me in my living room tonight. It's only right I be there to greet him when he comes. So that he was able to use short words, use storytelling abilities, and an intimacy that people felt the trust in him. Maybe that's the most important thing a leader needs to do. If he can establish trust in him, then he can do things, and they'll follow him, as they did during the Depression and then during World War II, when they had to sacrifice both the soldiers abroad and the people on the home front because they believed that he was doing the right thing. That's one of our problems today, is that trust in government has been diminished really since the 60s, after the Vietnam War and Watergate, and then all that's happened in these last couple decades, so that maybe the most important thing in order to get us going again is to find that trust again in ourselves and the people in our local and state areas, and then build that back up to the federal government.
Well, that's something we certainly need, and something a lot of folks approach me about is their lack of trust in all of our institutions. But I want to focus back on the 1960s, because you have a new book coming out about, is this your eighth?
Yes, indeed.
Book? Wow. Eighth book about the 1960s. So, Doris, tell us a little bit about what that book's going to be.
Well, it all started with boxes. My husband, who was almost everywhere in the 1960s, he worked for John Kennedy, he worked for LBJ, he was with McCarthy in New Hampshire against the war when he turned against the war, and he was with Bobby Kennedy when he died, and he was close to Jackie Kennedy. So he's sort of like a Forrest Gump of the 60s, and he saved everything, 300 boxes of every diary, letter, memo to the president, drafts of every speech. And for all of our married life, for 40 years, these boxes floated around with us, but he didn't want to open them, in part because the decade had ended so sadly. And then finally, when he turned 80, he said, it's now or never. So we had this great adventure of reliving the 60s together. And the extraordinary thing was that it gave him a sense of purpose in those last years of his life. Even when he got cancer, he just kept saying, I'm going to stay alive because I've got to get through these boxes and write a book. I was helping him to write a book. And then when he died, it's now my book. So it's called An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 60s. And it's an incredible decade. I mean, beside the sad things that happened, extraordinary things happened. I mean, JFK making people feel they could make a difference, the Peace Corps, and then you get into the Civil Rights Movement and the marches that created the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act after Selma, Alabama. And you have Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, so much that went on during that time that makes you realize that great things happen at the same time as really sad things happen. So I'm trying to, again, look at this decade and remind people that we have to look at the troubling times, and yet we'll see in those times often the people emerging. And there was just a groundswell of citizen activism during that period. Again, what we need today, where people really felt they could make a difference, and young people really felt motivated to do something for their country, and I'd love to see that again.
Well, that's what we hope for, and that's what we try to encourage here at Palm Beach Atlantic, to have these young people involved in policy and the issues that matter to our state and our country. And we're so thrilled that we could have Doris Kearns Goodwin here, a real historian star, to spend time with us here at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Thank you so much.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.